Language as a Barrier by Victoria Schmidt. So I'll be going over the different types of language barriers, the major theories and models, translation, different languages, a summary, and questions. So there are 5 different types of language barriers: linguistic, idiomatic, grammatical, syntactical, experiential, and conceptual. Linguistic barriers are also called linguistic imperialism. That is the use of a particular language being forced on people or a person by those with more power. It's also studying the words and languages and looking for similar sounding words with similar meanings in different languages. Linguistic characteristics and cultural norms influence each other in the Speer-Whorf linguistic determinism. Idiomatic barriers are also called idiomatic equivalence, which is an expression whose meaning is not predictable from the usual meanings of its words. The English language is particularly replete with idiosms and can translate to different meanings to other cultures. So because of idiosms, they make the English language very difficult to learn as a second language. Learning idiosms of a language can be an effective way to learning one's culture. These are some examples of idiomatic barriers that were pulled from the book in chapter 5. Then we have grammatical syntactical barriers, also called grammatical syntactical equivalence, which is when languages don't necessarily have the same grammar. So in English, words can be nouns, verbs, or adjectives depending on their position in a sentence. Then we have experiential barriers or experiential equivalence, which is if an object or experience does not exist in your culture, it's difficult to translate words referring to that object or experience into your language when no words exist for it. This is seen when a country speaks one language and is divided and kept separate for political reasons. An example of this is after World War II, Germany was divided and both Germanys, the East and the West, were kept separate for almost 50 years. The East and the West languages began to diverge to reflect the changing experience. Then there's conceptual barriers, which are also conceptual equivalents that refer to abstract ideas that may not exist in the same fashion in different languages. Example of this would be corruption. It has different meanings when looking at the US and another culture. So in the US, corruption is a crime and wrong on moral grounds, whereas in Korea, corruption is not morally wrong, but in the same sense that it refers with proper functioning of government and is bad on social consequences. So there can be misunderstandings with all words in each culture. There are 2 major theories and models that were discussed in chapter 5, and that's the Speer-Whorf hypotheses and bilingualism and code switching. So the Speer-Whorf hypothesis basically was the world as we know it is predetermined by the language of our culture. It also is reality is embedded in culture's language, and that language then controls thought and culture norms. So this is also known as the Whorfian thesis when accounting for differences in languages, which also was grammar and snacks, where Whorf felt grammar had greater influence than vocabulary. Benjamin L. Whorf was a successful fire prevention engineer at the Hartford Fire Insurance Company who encountered linguistic anthropologist Edward Spears, who taught at Yale. So there is no universal sign language. Several exist that were developed separately and passed down to each generation. And they also discuss that with this, meaning that because the sign language was passed down to each generation, that it morphed or changed over time, so it was never the exact same. If a language has a particular rich vocabulary for a thing or activity, it's important to that culture. And cultures don't have language to speak of change in their environment. So an example is speakers of diverse languages can perceive all different conditions of one word, like snow for the Eskimos. So throughout chapter 5, they discussed how the Eskimos or the Inuit had multiple different words for different types of snow, like snowdrifts or wet snow, fluffy snow, anything like that. So this is an example of what the Spear-Whorf hypothesis is, going over a definition of what it is and the examples for language and how you perceive the language. Bilingualism and code switching. So there are two different types of bilingualism. One is coordinate bilingual speakers are people who learn a second language later in life and typically use their second language in limited contexts. Then there's compound bilingual speakers, who are people who learned a second language early in life and use the language in many different contexts. People from China who learned English later in life versus people from Hong Kong learned English earlier in life. This was an example given through the book that people from China usually tend to learn English the older they are versus people from Hong Kong learn English the younger they are. Coordinate and compound speakers differences also show a culture difference independent of language. So what they were talking about for this is for anybody who learns a second language, the older they are, they don't use that language as often as somebody who learns a second language the younger they are, because they're more versed and have a better knowledge and understanding of how to speak it. So this is an example of bilingualism and code switching. Translation. Human translators understand each language's grammar, syntax, semantics, idioms, and culture to decode text in one language and encode its meaning into another. So human translators are also a lot faster at translating than machines are. Machine translation dates back to the end of World War II when coders recognized cryptography and deciphering were basically math problems. So this was fixed based off of rules based on systems, were the first to analyze the syntax of a sentence to identify subject, verb, object, and modifiers. And then the first machine translator was developed in 1954 to translate between Russian and English languages. There are also two-way voice translators involving speech recognition, machine translation, and voice synapsis were developed for handheld devices for use between English and Iraqi Arabic. A lot of U.S. military personnel continue and still use handheld machine translators. Nowadays, there are apps for translation like iTranslate Voice 3 and Google Translate, versus just using human translators, which are used quite often in a professional work setting, considering that there is an influx of Hmong-speaking and Spanish-speaking individuals who aren't very versed in the English language. So there are different types of languages. Pidgin is a mixture of two or more languages to form a new language that was originally used for trade. It's mostly used in West Africa and can be considered a second language. Then there's Creole, is a new language developed from prolonged contact of two or more languages. It's usually a mixture of English and West African languages. And this is acquired by children as their first language versus adults. They don't really, it would be more their second language. Esperanto is a simplified regular language with European grammar and vocabulary that can be learned in a fourth of the time it is needed to learn French or Spanish. English was the language of commerce, French of diplomacy, and German of science. That's what was dated back throughout, and I have heard about this going through middle school and high school. The spread of a language to common use around a region also means the spreading influence of the culture native to that language. There are many languages that are no longer spoken. A lot of it's more Indian language, and English is becoming a more common spoken language. Many countries have official language laws, and the US does not. So, in summary, language is both a tool and a barrier in intercultural communication. There are misunderstandings due to language because of how it can impact personal and professional interactions. There are effective strategies like cultural awareness and language training, which can reduce these barriers, as well as understanding and respecting language differences can lead to more successful intercultural communication and build bridges between diverse cultures. The questions I have for you are, how do you think language can affect the way people are perceived in intercultural communication? Can we ever fully overcome the language barrier? And finally, have you ever experienced a situation where a language barrier caused a misunderstanding? And how did you handle it, and what did you learn from it? Thank you. And this is my reference page.